Some legends begin with a gunshot, but this one began with a man who stopped riding. Caleb Whitaker had no reason to slow his horse that evening, not on a stretch of desert that most men crossed without looking back. The trail cut through dry grass and pale dust, running straight for miles beneath a copper-colored sunset, and Caleb had been riding since early morning with nothing on his mind except the promise of water and a warm lantern waiting at the next town 15 miles east. His horse moved steady beneath him, hooves tapping a patient rhythm against the hardened ground, the kind of quiet sound a man could listen to for hours without thinking about anything at all. That was why he noticed the smoke. At first it was only a thin line drifting above the distant ridge, the sort of smoke that could come from a campfire or a ranch house stove. But this smoke climbed higher than any cooking fire should, twisting slowly into the sky like a dark ribbon pulled by the wind. Caleb narrowed his eyes and shifted in the saddle, letting the reins loosen as his horse slowed to an uncertain walk. Out here a man learned to read the land the same way he read a map, and smoke like that meant something had gone wrong somewhere beyond the hills. He should have kept riding. That would have been the sensible choice. The trail ahead was safe, the daylight fading fast, and whatever trouble waited beyond the ridge belonged to someone else. Caleb even nudged his horse forward once, as if to prove to himself he meant to ignore it. But the wind shifted, carrying the smell of burned timber and dry sage across the open plain, and something in that scent made his hands tighten on the reins. He turned the horse toward the ridge. The climb was slow and uneven, scattered with rocks and stubborn brush that scratched against his boots as he rode higher. And by the time Caleb reached the top, the sun had nearly disappeared behind the mountains. From that ridge the valley opened wide beneath him, and what he saw there made him draw a long breath and sit very still in the saddle. Far below, an Apache village stood in quiet ruin, its small wooden homes reduced to dark shapes beneath drifting clouds of smoke, the last glow of firelight fading as evening settled over the desert. The wind moved gently through the valley, lifting loose ash into the air like gray snow. Caleb had seen abandoned camps before, but something about this place felt different, as if the land itself had paused to remember what had happened there only hours earlier. He guided his horse down the slope slowly, careful with each step as the shadows deepened across the ground. And as he reached the edge of the silent village, his eyes moved across the empty paths, the fallen fences, the quiet circles where cooking fires had once burned. That was when he saw her. At first, she looked like another shadow among the smoke, a single figure standing near the remains of a small lodge, unmoving while the evening wind stirred the edges of her dark hair. She was young, no older than 20 by the look of her, dressed in traditional Apache clothing dusted with ash from the ground beneath her feet. She wasn't running, wasn't hiding, wasn't even looking around the way someone lost might do. Instead, she knelt in the fading light, brushing aside gray powder with steady hands, as if searching for something small among the ruins of a life that had existed only that morning. Caleb stopped his horse 20 yards away and watched in silence, unsure whether to speak or turn back the way he had come. The girl never looked up at him. She kept searching through the ashes with calm determination, like someone who knew exactly what she had come to find. The girl found what she had been searching for beneath the ashes just as the last light of the sun slipped behind the mountains. Caleb watched her fingers pause in the gray dust, then close gently around something small hidden in the ground, as if she had been certain it would still be there. She lifted the object slowly and brushed it clean with careful movements that carried more patience than panic. Even from where he sat on his horse, he could see the faint glimmer of turquoise catching the fading light. It was a pendant, wrapped in thin silver wire and tied to a worn leather cord, the kind of object that did not belong to the desert or the smoke around them, but to something older and quieter. The girl held it in both hands for a moment, studying it the way someone studies a memory rather than a possession. Only then did she notice him. Her head turned slightly, dark eyes meeting his across the empty ground between them. Caleb had faced many looks in his life, suspicion, anger, curiosity, but this one was different. It carried no fear and no gratitude. It was simply the calm awareness of someone who had already decided that whatever happened next would not surprise her. Caleb eased one hand away from the reins and lifted it slowly, palm open in a gesture that meant he meant no harm. The horse shifted beneath him, restless in the quiet village, but he kept his voice low and steady when he spoke. "I was passing through," he said. "I saw the smoke from the ridge." The girl did not answer right away. Instead, she stood, dust falling softly from the edges of her clothing as the evening wind moved through the village. The pendant disappeared beneath the collar of her dress as she tied the leather cord around her neck with practiced hands. When she finished, she looked back at him with the same steady expression. "You should leave," she said quietly. Her English carried the soft rhythm of someone who had learned it slowly over many seasons. "This place will not be safe for long." Caleb studied the empty valley behind her. The village was silent now, the smoke drifting higher into a sky turning deep blue with night. Nothing moved along the distant hills, and the wind carried no sound except the creak of his saddle leather. He frowned slightly. What happened here? The girl glanced toward the far end of the village where the ground sloped toward the riverbed. For a moment something passed across her face that looked almost like sadness, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Men came who do not belong to this land," she said. "They asked questions no one here could answer." Caleb felt the weight of her words settle into the quiet air. He had traveled enough miles across the frontier to understand the kind of trouble that followed men who asked the wrong questions. He shifted in the saddle again and looked back toward the ridge he had crossed earlier. The trail east still waited for him. 15 miles of empty road and a warm lantern in town. He could leave now and never think about this place again. Yet when he looked back at the girl standing among the ashes, he noticed something he had missed before. She was not looking at him anymore. Her eyes had moved toward the northern hills where the land folded into narrow stone canyons. Caleb followed her gaze and listened carefully. At first he heard nothing. Then the faint sound reached him through the evening air. Distant hoofbeats, still far away, but moving steadily across the desert like a storm that had already chosen its direction. The sound of the approaching riders drifted across the desert like a warning carried on the wind, slow at first and almost easy to dismiss, but growing clearer with every passing second. Caleb Whitaker had spent enough years on the frontier to recognize that rhythm immediately. Horses moving with purpose, not wandering travelers, not traders heading home before nightfall. Whoever was coming through those northern hills was riding hard and riding together. Caleb turned his head slightly, listening without moving in the saddle, the way a man does when instinct begins to speak louder than reason. The girl had heard it too. She did not look frightened, but the stillness in her shoulders changed in a way that told him everything he needed to know. She stepped closer to him, her voice lower now, almost carried away by the wind. "They are looking for me." Caleb glanced down at her, studying the calm certainty in her eyes. That pendant around her neck was no ordinary piece of silver and stone. He could see that now. It carried meaning, the kind of meaning men were willing to ride long miles to claim. "How far behind are they?" he asked. The girl tilted her head slightly, as if measuring the distance through the ground itself. "Not far enough for safety," she answered quietly. Caleb followed her gaze toward the northern ridge again. The desert was turning darker with every minute, the last light of day fading into a wide blue shadow that stretched across the valley floor. Soon it would be night, and the open land would belong to whoever knew it best. He looked back at the empty village, then down at the girl standing beside his horse. "You got a name," he said after a moment. She met his eyes. Again, calm as the desert wind. "Naeli," she said. Caleb nodded once. "Caleb Whitaker." For a brief moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt heavier now, filled with the distant thunder of hooves rolling closer across the plains. Caleb glanced at the ridge behind him, the trail he had taken down into the valley. It would take a good rider 10 minutes to climb back up the slope and reach the open trail again. Maybe less if the horse was strong. He exhaled slowly and looked down at Naeli once more. "You planning to outrun them on foot?" he asked. She did not answer right away. Instead, she glanced toward the narrow canyon walls rising on the far side of the valley, their dark shapes cutting into the sky like silent guardians of the desert. "There are paths through those rocks that strangers do not know," she said. "My people have used them for generations." Caleb studied the canyon entrance, calculating the distance with the same quiet precision that had kept him alive through years of rough country. A quarter mile across open ground. Too far to walk before those riders reached the village. The sound of hooves was clearer now, echoing faintly between the hills. Caleb made his decision without another word. He leaned down from the saddle and extended his hand. "Get on," he said simply. Naeli looked at his hand, then at his face, as if weighing something that had nothing to do with horses or distance. "You do not know me," she said. Caleb allowed the smallest hint of a tired smile to cross his face. "I know enough," he replied. "The riders are coming, and you are still standing here instead of running. That tells me more than most men say in a lifetime." The desert wind moved through the silent village as the sound of hooves rolled closer across the darkening plain. The moment stretched for only a second before Naeli reached up and took Caleb Whitaker's hand. Her grip was steady, stronger than he expected, and in one smooth motion she stepped into the stirrup and swung up behind him onto the saddle. Caleb gathered the reins and turned his horse toward the open valley, the animal already sensing the urgency in the air. The distant riders were closer now, their hoofbeats echoing softly through the desert like thunder rolling across dry ground. Caleb leaned forward slightly and spoke to the horse in a low voice. The animal surged forward, carrying them out of the silent village and into the wide stretch of desert beyond. The wind rushed past them as they rode, carrying the faint scent of smoke and ash from the village behind. Naeli held the back of the saddle with one hand, her other hand resting lightly near the pendant hidden beneath her clothing, as if confirming it was still there. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the horse galloping across the hard desert floor. After nearly a quarter mile, Caleb slowed the horse slightly as the land began to rise toward the rocky formations Naeli had pointed out earlier. The canyon entrance stood ahead like a dark doorway cut into the earth, its tall stone walls catching the last pale light of evening. Caleb glanced back once over his shoulder. In the distance he could see shapes moving along the ridge line. Riders. At least 4 of them, maybe more, silhouetted against the fading sky. He turned forward again and guided the horse toward the canyon. They reached the mouth of the passage just as the last strip of sunlight disappeared beyond the mountains. The air inside the canyon felt cooler, the tall rock walls blocking the wind and holding the quiet of the desert night. Caleb slowed the horse to a careful walk as the narrow path curved deeper between the stone cliffs. After a few moments he spoke without turning around. "You said there were paths strangers do not know." Naeli nodded behind him, though he could not see the motion clearly in the darkening canyon. "Yes," she answered quietly. "This land remembers the footsteps of my people." Caleb allowed a small breath of relief to escape him, though he kept his eyes on the winding trail ahead. The canyon floor twisted through the rock like a hidden road, turning sharply every 100 yards and disappearing into shadow. Anyone who did not know these paths would lose time trying to follow them. Still, Caleb understood the truth of the frontier. Riders who were determined enough could follow tracks long after the trail had gone cold. After several minutes, Naeli spoke again, her voice softer now that the thunder of hooves had faded behind them. "Why did you stop back there, Caleb Whitaker?" Most men would have ridden the other direction when they saw the smoke. Caleb considered the question while guiding the horse over a patch of loose stones. Finally, he answered in the plain tone of someone stating a simple fact. Because someone was still standing there. The canyon walls closed around them as darkness settled fully across the desert sky, and far behind them the faint sound of distant riders continued to move across the empty valley. The canyon grew darker with every turn of the narrow trail, the tall stone walls swallowing the last traces of twilight until only a thin ribbon of pale sky remained above them. Caleb Whitaker guided the horse carefully through the twisting passage, letting the animal choose its footing among scattered stones and shallow dips carved by years of desert rain. The quiet inside the canyon felt different from the open valley they had left behind. Sound carried strangely here. Even the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves seemed softer, as if the earth itself had learned to keep secrets. After nearly half a mile, the canyon widened slightly into a small basin where the ground flattened and a few twisted desert trees leaned against the rock walls. Caleb slowed the horse and finally brought it to a stop beside one of the trees. The animal lowered its head gratefully, breathing slow clouds of warm air into the cool night. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavy but not uncomfortable, the kind that settles between two people who both understand that the next decision matters more than the last mile they traveled. Caleb swung one leg over and stepped down from the saddle, boots crunching lightly against gravel. Naeli slid down a moment later with the quiet balance of someone used to rough ground. She stood beside the horse and glanced back toward the narrow canyon entrance they had just passed through. The distant hoofbeats were no longer audible, but that did not mean the riders had turned away. Caleb loosened the saddle straps slightly to give the horse relief and then looked toward her. "This place safe for the night?" he asked. Naeli studied the canyon walls surrounding them before answering. "For now," she said quietly. "These paths divide deeper into the mountains. Only a few people remember which ones lead out." Again, Caleb nodded slowly and moved toward a flat stone near the base of the canyon wall. The moon had begun to rise above the cliffs, casting a faint silver glow across the basin. It was enough light to see the outline of the pendant resting against Naeli's chest as she untied the leather cord and held the stone in her palm. Caleb noticed the way she looked at it, not with pride, but with the careful attention someone gives to something that carries responsibility. "That little stone must be worth quite a ride across the desert," he said quietly. Naeli did not smile. "This is not about worth," she answered. "It is about who decides the future of my people." Caleb leaned back against the stone and crossed his arms loosely. The desert had taught him that every object carried a story, and the smaller the object, the heavier the story usually became. He studied the turquoise stone glimmering softly in the moonlight. "That stone belongs to the Council of Elders, does it not?" Naeli looked up at him with mild surprise. "You know of it?" Caleb shrugged slightly. "I listen more than I talk when I travel through Apache land." The silence returned for a moment as the night wind slipped through the canyon. Then Naeli spoke again, her voice quieter now. "The men who came today want this stone because it decides who speaks for the tribe when the old chiefs are gone. If they control the one who carries it, they control every voice that follows." Caleb absorbed her words slowly, looking up toward the narrow strip of stars above the canyon walls. Somewhere beyond those cliffs, riders were still searching the desert floor. He pushed himself away from the rock and walked toward the canyon entrance, studying the dark path that led back toward the valley. Finally, he spoke without turning around. "Then those riders are not just hunting you, Naeli. They are hunting the future." The night settled deeper into the canyon as the moon climbed higher above the cliffs, turning the stone walls pale silver and casting long shadows across the basin where Caleb Whitaker and Naeli stood. The desert had grown quiet again, but it was not the comfortable quiet of an empty land. It was the kind that carried the weight of unfinished things. Caleb remained near the canyon entrance for a moment longer, studying the faint trail they had followed into the rocks. The ground there was hard and dry, which meant their tracks would not last long once the wind returned. But riders who were determined enough rarely relied on tracks alone. They relied on patience. And patience was something men chasing power often had plenty of. He finally turned back toward the small basin where Naeli still stood beside the horse. The turquoise pendant rested again against her chest, catching the pale light whenever she moved. Caleb walked slowly toward her, his boots grinding softly against the gravel. The horse shifted its weight and flicked its ears as if listening for distant movement that neither of them could yet hear. After a moment, Caleb spoke in a calm voice. "The men following you must know what that stone means." Naeli nodded once. "They do. The man who leads them believes that whoever carries the pendant can be forced to speak for the tribe." Caleb leaned his shoulder lightly against the rough bark of one of the desert trees. "That sounds like a man who understands very little about the people he is trying to control." Naeli allowed the faintest trace of a smile to appear before it disappeared again. "Many men believe they understand something simply because they can reach it with their hands." The night wind slipped through the canyon again, stirring the dry branches above them. Caleb studied the sky for a moment before lowering his gaze back to her. "If that pendant chooses the voice of the elders, then why is it with you instead of them?" Naeli hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because the answer carried more weight than the question. Finally, she spoke quietly. "Because the elders knew this day would come." Caleb watched her expression carefully. "They expected someone to try to take it." "Yes." She looked toward the dark canyon paths stretching deeper into the mountains. "The elders said that when the land becomes uncertain, the stone must travel with someone who can move through both worlds." Caleb frowned slightly. "Both worlds?" Naeli met his eyes again. "Someone who understands the ways of my people, but also understands the ways of the settlers who now cross this land." The meaning of her words settled slowly between them. Caleb let out a quiet breath and rubbed the back of his neck as if trying to shake loose a thought that had already found its way there. You are saying the elders sent you away with it? Naeli nodded. They said the one who carries the stone must be willing to walk a path no one else will choose. The moon climbed higher above the canyon, and the basin grew brighter with pale light. Caleb stepped away from the tree and looked again toward the dark canyon trails stretching into the mountains. There were many paths ahead, each twisting into country that could hide a traveler for days if they knew where to go. He finally spoke in the steady voice of a man who had spent most of his life riding uncertain roads. Then it seems the desert decided our paths crossed tonight for a reason. The canyon basin rested beneath a quiet sky, filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch if a man climbed the stone walls high enough. The moon had risen further now, pouring pale light across the gravel and the twisted desert trees, and the air carried the cool stillness that only came after midnight in the high desert. Caleb Whitaker remained standing near the edge of the basin, looking toward the narrow trails that wound deeper into the mountains. Somewhere out there the land folded into miles of hidden valleys and forgotten passes that only a handful of riders would ever learn to follow. Behind him, Naeli watched in silence, the turquoise pendant resting against her chest like a quiet promise she had not yet decided how to carry. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Caleb finally turned back toward her. The moonlight caught the calm lines of his face as he studied her expression. You said the elders chose someone who could walk between two worlds, he said slowly. That sounds like a heavy road to travel alone. Naeli lowered her gaze briefly to the pendant before answering. The road is never meant to be easy. Caleb gave a small nod as if he had expected that answer. The desert had taught him the same lesson many years ago. A quiet breeze drifted down through the canyon, stirring the loose sand along the basin floor. Caleb stepped away from the canyon entrance and walked toward the horse, resting one hand along the animal's neck while he spoke again. The men chasing you will not stop simply because the night is long. Naeli shook her head slightly. They believe the stone will give them power. Men who believe that kind of thing rarely stop. Caleb looked toward the canyon walls again, then back toward her. The path through these mountains must lead somewhere safe. Naeli considered the question carefully before answering. There is a valley nearly 30 miles from here where the elders sometimes meet during the summer seasons. It is hidden beyond two ridges and a river crossing. Few settlers know it exists. Caleb nodded slowly as he measured the distance in his mind. 30 miles through rough canyon trails meant most of tomorrow would be spent in the saddle. Still, distance was sometimes the best kind of protection a traveler could find. He glanced at the sky once more before speaking again. Then that valley is where we ride at first light. Naeli looked at him with quiet surprise. You speak as though you are part of this journey now. Caleb allowed a faint smile to appear, though there was nothing playful in it. He tipped his hat back slightly and looked toward the canyon entrance where the trail disappeared into shadow. When I stopped my horse on that ridge earlier tonight, he said calmly, I stepped off the road I was traveling. The desert wind moved softly through the canyon as his words settled into the quiet. Naeli studied him carefully, as though trying to understand the decision he had already made. You do not belong to my people, she said. No, Caleb replied. But I have ridden these lands long enough to know when a person needs someone watching the trail behind them. The stars continued their slow journey across the sky while the canyon held their quiet conversation. Somewhere far beyond the cliffs the desert stretched wide and uncertain, and for the first time since the village had burned, Naeli felt that the road ahead might not be one she had to travel alone. Morning arrived slowly in the canyon, the first pale light of dawn slipping over the tall stone walls and spreading across the gravel basin, where Caleb Whitaker and Naeli had rested through the quiet hours of the night. The desert woke without noise. A faint breeze moved through the canyon, and the sky shifted from deep blue to a soft gray that promised clear weather ahead. Caleb was already awake before the sun appeared. Years of riding the frontier had trained him to rise before daylight, especially when the road ahead carried uncertainty. He stood near the edge of the basin studying the narrow canyon trail that curved toward the eastern ridge. The ground there remained quiet, untouched except for the faint tracks left by their horse. Naeli stepped toward him a moment later, the turquoise pendant resting against her chest as the first rays of sunlight reached the canyon floor. The silver wire around the stone caught the light briefly before she covered it again beneath her clothing. Caleb nodded once toward the trail. "We should move before the desert wakes fully," he said. Naeli agreed without hesitation. The riders searching the valley would not wait long once daylight returned. Caleb tightened the saddle and mounted the horse, then reached down to help her climb up behind him. The horse moved forward into the narrow canyon passage with steady confidence, its hooves echoing softly against the stone walls as they began the long ride deeper into the mountains. The trail twisted upward for nearly a mile before the canyon widened into a rocky slope that overlooked the desert valley far behind them. Caleb slowed the horse briefly and turned in the saddle to study the land they had left. From that high ridge the desert stretched wide and silent beneath the rising sun, its pale sand glowing gold in the early light. For a moment it looked peaceful enough to hide the trouble moving somewhere across its empty miles. Then Caleb saw them, small dark shapes moving slowly along the edge of the valley floor. Riders, too far away to recognize faces, but close enough for a careful man to understand their direction. They had found the canyon entrance. Caleb faced forward again and guided the horse along the narrow mountain path. "They are still following," he said calmly. Naeli looked back only once before returning her gaze to the winding trail ahead. "They will continue until the stone is no longer within their reach." The path grew steeper as they rode higher into the mountains, turning between tall ridges of weathered rock that cast long shadows across the ground. After nearly 2 miles, the trail narrowed into a passage between two towering cliffs. The place felt different from the rest of the canyon. The wind moved more slowly there, and the echoes of the horse's hooves carried farther into the still air. Caleb slowed the horse to a careful walk as he studied the terrain. This place would force any riders behind them to pass through the same narrow ground. Naeli watched him quietly as he guided the horse to a stop near the center of the passage. "You are thinking about something," she said. Caleb slid down from the saddle and looked back toward the distant trail they had followed. "Just measuring time," he answered. The desert sun climbed higher behind the cliffs while the wind moved gently through the stone corridor. Somewhere beyond the ridge behind them, the riders continued their slow approach across the valley. Caleb Whitaker stood in the narrow stone passage while the morning sun climbed slowly over the mountain ridge behind him. The light stretched across the canyon walls in long golden bands that warmed the cool air of the high desert. Naeli remained beside the horse a few steps away, watching the same trail that Caleb had been studying since they arrived. The distant riders had not yet appeared in the passage, but the quiet certainty of the frontier told both of them that they would. The desert had a way of guiding determined men along the same roads whether they understood the land or not. Caleb finally turned away from the canyon entrance and looked toward the higher ridge that stretched ahead of them. The path that continued through those rocks twisted another mile before opening into the northern pass that led toward the hidden valley Naeli had described the night before. From there the land would spread into miles of broken hills where a traveler could disappear from the world if they knew where to ride. He stepped toward the horse and rested his hand along the animal's neck, his voice calm as ever when he spoke. "Once we cross the next ridge, the trail will divide 3 different ways. Anyone following us will lose time deciding which road we chose." Naeli studied his face carefully as if trying to understand the quiet plan already forming behind his eyes. "You speak as though you will not ride those roads with me," she said. Caleb adjusted the saddle strap once more before answering. "Someone will need to remain here long enough to make sure those riders choose the wrong direction." The wind moved through the narrow canyon again, carrying the faint smell of warm stone and distant sage. Naeli shook her head slightly. "That is not your responsibility." Caleb allowed a small, tired smile to appear. "Responsibility is a strange thing out here. Sometimes it finds a man before he knows he is looking for it." He helped her climb onto the horse and placed the reins gently into her hands. "Follow the trail until the canyon opens into the ridge above," he said. "When you reach the split, take the path that bends toward the north-facing cliffs. It will lead you to the river crossing and then to the valley you spoke of." Naeli hesitated only for a moment before speaking. "You have done enough already." Caleb stepped back from the horse and glanced once more toward the canyon entrance behind them where the distant riders would soon appear. The desert sun climbed higher into the sky, lighting the stone walls and the narrow ground between them. He tipped his hat slightly in her direction. The desert is wide, Nieli. Sometimes the right road appears only because two travelers meet at the same crossing. She studied him for a long moment, the turquoise pendant resting quietly against her chest. Then she turned the horse toward the rising trail and rode slowly toward the upper ridge where the canyon opened to the mountains beyond. Caleb remained where he stood until the sound of the horse's hooves faded into the distance. Only then did he walk calmly toward the narrow entrance of the stone passage and lean against the canyon wall, watching the empty desert valley below. Years later, travelers would speak of a story carried through the frontier like a quiet legend. They spoke of a woman who rose to guide her people through a time of uncertainty, wearing a turquoise stone that symbolized the voice of the elders. And when the story was told among the Apache fires at night, someone would always mention the cowboy who once stood alone in a canyon so that the future could ride safely into the mountains.